Hello and welcome to Racecraft once again. This time I'd like to talk to you about wheel bearings, in particular front wheel drive front wheel bearings. They're a split bearing. When you assemble them into the hub and tighten up the nut, the two center parts touch each other and give you the correct clearance for the bearing. I've been using these wheel bearings in a conversion that I do, and I started off using NSK bearings, but it was brought to my attention that there was a wobble in some of the wheels. So after quite a lot of checking, I managed to trace it down to the bearing itself. Now, when I spoke to the rep from NSK and showed him the bearings, he assured me that there was nothing wrong with the bearings and that it was the way that I was using them. And what he told me was that the bearing is made for a Toyota Camry, and because I'm not using them in a Camry, that's the problem. Well, that's not the problem, and that's what I'm going to show you. Here's my setup. I've clamped it down onto the milling machine here, so we've got as steady and a firm a table as possible. So I've got the flange clamped to the table. I've got my CV shaft in there. It's all torqued up, and you can see the hub here. The bearings rotates. It's quite loose, and I've got the dial indicator set on it. And with this long bar here, I can actually put a bit of load onto that bearing, and you can see that the pointer on the needle there. Oh, it's barely moving. I'm putting a fair bit of effort on this. Now, this bearing is an early NSK bearing. I've actually got 2014 written on there, so that's about when I started doing this particular conversion. And the bearings were good as gold. So now I'm going to change this over, and I'm going to put a late NSK bearing in here and test it in exactly the same way. Alright, I've got the NSK bearing set up here. This is a late bearing. This is quite new. And if you have a look at the dial indicator here, you can see we've got quite a lot of movement there. Now, although that's only about 0.004 right here, what you've got to imagine that when you've got your wheel bolted to the flange and to the outside edges of the wheels, your wheel's going to wobble around quite a bit. That's going to convert to about somewhere between 5 and 10 millimeters rock in the top and bottom of the wheel, which is an unacceptable amount of movement. Now, when I asked the rep when he was here, I showed him this in this way, and I asked him, how come we've got an early bearing with no movement in it and a late bearing with a lot of wobble in it? He said to me that this bearing is on bottom tolerance and this bearing is on top tolerance, and they're both within tolerance. Well, I don't agree with that. Why would you build that much movement into a bearing? So think about this. If you're going to take your car and get a wheel alignment and the wheels can wobble backwards and forwards, how do you know you're going to get the right wheel alignment? When you drive your car, if you've got a clunk coming from the front end, it could very well be a bearing like this. So you need bearings that don't have any movement in them. And to that end, I've assembled up some other bearings. That's a GMB bearing and a Suzumi bearing. And I'm going to set those up in the same way, and we're going to compare how much movement these other bearings have to the wobble in the NSK bearing. I've got the Suzumi bearing set up here exactly the same way as we did the NSK bearing. So if you come in close here, you can see the dial indicator. I'm leaning on the bar here, and we've got barely half of 1/1000th of movement. And I'm leaning on this bar fairly hard. So that's how a wheel bearing should be, nice and tight. This is the GMB bearing. It's fairly clear there. I'm going to set this up now with the CV joint, and we'll see how that works. This time I've got the GMB bearing set up here. Again, the same as we did the NSK bearing. And if I wobble this arm up and down, you can see we've got virtually no movement in the dial indicator there at all, which again is the way that a wheel bearing should be. Now when I showed this to the rep from NSK, and I showed him the early bearing and the late bearing, he said to me, oh, it's because you're not using the bearings for what they were designed for. So I'm using a wheel bearing as a wheel bearing, but he said to me, it's because I'm not putting them in a Toyota Camry. So no warranty, no help, no compensation. It's a pretty sad outcome. So if you've got these types of bearings in your car, you really need to check your wheel bearings. Get the wheel top and bottom with the car jacked up and see whether the wheel rocks backwards and forwards. If you go to buy new bearings and you're offered an NSK bearing, I guess what you need to ask is the bearing you're selling me on top tolerance or bottom tolerance? Because I only want to buy the ones that are on bottom tolerance. The rep also assures me that the bearings, the NSK bearings, are now definitely not made in China. So draw your conclusions from that. Anyway, I hope this has been informative. If you've got a front wheel drive car and you're scrubbing out the inside edges of the tyres, it's probably because when you got your wheel alignment done, the wheel alignment man has done his job properly. But when you put your foot on the brake and that looseness in the bearings makes your wheels toe out, that's going to scrub out the inside edges of your tyres. So if you're having tyre wear problems, if you've got knocks in the front, that sort of thing, you're getting a kickback through the steering wheel, it could very well be the front wheel bearing. Anyway, hope this helps. Thanks for tuning in.